And again, I'll show you Worden in context in a second. Okay? The complicating factor for all of us to map this stuff is, this stuff's actually all been uplifted by this thing called isostatic rebound. If you're really into it, I can send you papers to read on that. It's really not as interesting as you might think. But basically the whole landscape was uplifted when the ice sheet left here. Complicates the story for us, not so much for you guys within one small watershed. Okay? But what it tells us or allows us to do is somebody recognized as far back as the 1940s and really got cemented in the 80s, early 80s with Karl Koteff, that we had these little chunks of sediment that were all related to one another and not related to anything else. And so this allowed, suddenly people could really figure out how our valleys, like the Wood River or our local valleys, got filled up with sediment and how this actually worked. Okay? And it allows us to actually trace out how many different times the ice stopped on its way out of a watershed, or at least a rough guess on them. So don't worry about all this terminology. The reason I'm showing you all this is that we can look at this guy right here. I'm going to flip it around from north to south because that's what you find in the watershed. If we were to get into an airplane and fly over Congdon Hill all the way down to Worden Pond right here, okay, you'd go over a whole series of glacial deposits. Okay? And all of these piles of sand, maybe there's a gravel pit in each one of them. As I was looking on Google Earth to find where your office was, there's a whole lot of gravel pits that I didn't realize when I was coming up through Hope Valley. They're all in these different glacial deposits. They're really not mining the modern river deposits. There isn't a lot of sediment, as you guys know, moving around in the active river. They're mostly mining the glacial deposits that are in the same valleys the present river occupies. Okay. And what that takes us to is you've got a couple of key features. You've got the Congdon Hill moraine, not really a big statewide noteworthy feature. Within, Denise was filling me in on the wild and scenic designation, which I know nothing about other than you just told me the name of it. Not really a big deal. Charlestown moraine is a bigger deal. Again, we've places like Glacial Park and Westerly, if you had a good exposure kind of on the fringe of your watershed. But kind of the largest glacial feature within it is Glacial Lake Worden, or what is Worden Pond today. And all of this purple stuff is actually the deposits of Glacial Lake Worden. Janet Friedman, if you follow coastal stuff, works for Rhode Island CRMC. She actually did a master's thesis on this with John Boothroyd in the 1990s. Did coring on it, figured out how long how long Glacial Lake Worden, let me back that up, when Glacial Lake Worden basically became a wetland, and tried to figure out the regional timing of it using pollen and plant fossils. That's probably from a glacial perspective, your coolest feature in your watershed is Worden Pond in that area.
When you talk about when Glacial Lake Worden became a wetland, you're referring to the Great Swamp Management Area, all that wetland that kind of surrounds?
It's when it stopped being we don't have a great date on exactly when it would have stopped being a glacial lake and drained. It's pretty shallow. There wasn't actually much lake there. The bay, even like present Worden Pond, if you go pike fishing in it, what is it, 3 feet deep? You always joke, you don't need a life jacket, you fall in, it's that deep. But it would have been a lake for a while, and it basically got so full of sediment there was only a little water left. But sometime around, and Janet would correct me if she was here, 15-ish thousand years ago, they had the earliest formation of basically wetlands. It would have become something related to what Great Swamp is today. Different types of vegetation and stuff. But yeah, that would have been when you started to have a wetland there. So it's not, the water molecules aren't the same glacial like water molecules, but the basin and the landform is a relic of that glaciation. So I threw a lot at you in a short amount of time, because I don't ever said you want to start on time to get out early or get home on time. What do you do with all this kind of information? Well, one of the things I wanted to do is point you towards a resource that we developed a couple of years ago. And so I went and looked at what quads are in your watershed. Quad map is the U.S. Geological Survey designated area. So they grid up the entire lower 48 states, and they do it by 7.5 minutes of latitude, 7.5 minutes of longitude. So they don't follow town boundaries, state boundaries. You see Voluntown and Oneko clip both states. But you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think 12 or 13, I counted, quads that cover your watershed as Rye just has it delineated, which I'm assuming you guys think is okay as a watershed boundary, all the way from Wickford over to Anico and down to Watch Hill and Mystic. Okay. The reason I show you that is a couple of years ago, John had this project, and I came into it kicking and screaming. If you knew John, after John fell and broke his hip in 2012, I didn't kick and scream. I willingly helped him out, but I didn't get into the project in the beginning because, well, I didn't want to. But we ended up doing a big project for geothermal energy. And you tend to think, oh, Iceland or California, but passive geothermal as well, which uses the heat or the natural temperature of the earth to both help heat and cool your house. And so this national initiative was to consolidate all of the geologic data they could into basically repositories. So if you were a well driller and you wanted to go put a new, or you had a client that wanted a new well put in, you could search by latitude or longitude or by town and find other wells that have been drilled, geologic maps, and other pertinent information for your business. The added bonus is for all of us, all of these different resources, and what are surficial maps, they really mean glacial maps, are now available. We scanned them at a fairly high resolution. If you do GIS, if you get a lease, can download them and bring them into Google, into ArcMap, they're all here as a resource. So I left this link in the presentation. It'll take you just to this directory, and you can find every quad, every map that we could find for the state of Rhode Island. And when you unzip it, there's what's called a TIFF image. There's another thing called a TFW that works with GIS. But a TIFF image will often open in various photo programs. So you can get all those on there, and more than you ever wanted to find. There are also some USGS reports. One of them, the link is down here, by Janet Stone. They've done some groundwater work on some of the smaller subwatersheds within Rhode Island. One of the big applications for my science, for glacial geology, besides just knowing about the regional history, is these are often our aquifers. So knowing the volume, the location, the thickness of this sediment deposited by the last glacier in the Wisconsin, and tells us how much water you might get out of a site. So there's a lot of groundwater application to this work, actually. So you can find that as well in some of these links that I put on the slides. And with that, that's all I managed to cram into my allotted time. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss, or you can follow up with email some other time. Yes, sir.
One of the interesting things just north of the Charleston Ravine, economically, are all the farms that have been turf farms, potato farms, and whatever. And that's all very fine sand that goes in. I mean, I've heard it goes down to 20 feet.
Oh, easily, yeah, on the deltas.
And that has been a very important geological feature that's contributed to a lot of activity in our area.
Absolutely. If you go to Kingston and Peckham Farm and all that, those are all turf fields, are on these same kind of glacial deltas. Absolutely. And
But these are behind them.
it's the same type of deposit, though.
Right.
So as the ice retreated north, and I wish I hadn't pulled it out for time, I pulled a couple of slides out on post-glacial climate, and one of them showed what we call pattern ground. So permafrost, or permanently frozen ground, actually leaves scars on the landscape because it's like putting my water bottle in the freezer. It makes it expand and contract when the water expands and contracts. And my colleague from the soil survey, looking through Google Earth one day, we could see the outline of all that pattern ground in Peckham Farm. So I wish, having that question, I would have put that slide back in, but absolutely. So the fact that the deltas were there, they're flat, they're good to mine, they've got well-drained soil. Yeah, a lot of the turf farms are on these deltas. Absolutely. Farmers knew land use and knew glacial geology without knowing glacial geology. Yeah. The other trick John and I used to talk about when we would map these areas, if you want to find, know when you're on till, you look for lots of stone walls. Because if you're in the middle of one of these deltas, there's no boulders. So you find handmade stone walls on the till. It's a good first order way of mapping. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to make mention that the Westerly Wood Trust has an area, I guess under its cognizance, on, I believe it's Airport Road, by where the post office is.
That's Glacial Park that I mentioned.
Yeah,
yep.
Yeah. And a couple of months ago, they had like a little guided tour of that area.
Oh, cool.
And I think if people were interested and they got in touch with the Westerly Land Trust, I would expect that they'd probably be able to get something together again.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
It's a beautiful site. So I teach at Eastern. I took my class down to see that because it is such a good exposure of a moraine. And then if you juxtapose that and go over to Ledyard in Connecticut and walk the pile of boulders there, they're both moraines. They both mark where the ice was. Completely different looking features, except for the fact that they're both hills. So yeah, it's a great exposure. I live like a mile from there. I take my son there hiking all the time.
We got a very large boulder field about a mile from here.
Okay, so one of the things that would be interesting if you knew where it was in space, if it lines up with one of these. Where's my map? Or if Cliff Vanover has it mapped already. So it's possible it could line up with Wolf Rocks. I'm not sure. You see those little dashes, it's a discontinuous landform. It doesn't form one single ridge, but yeah, it could be certainly part of Wolf Rocks. And some of those may be mapped on those glacial maps. I'm not.
Does Lantern Hill and Ledyard, is that part of the boulder fields that you're talking about?
No, Lantern Hill.
What is that geologic feature for?
Lantern Hill's just a big bedrock exposure.
All right.
So with one boulder that hangs funny off the side there. So and that's a nice hike too, though. I drive by that every day when I go to work. I don't go to work in the summertime. My office is down here in the summer.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Questions?
Well, I wish you guys luck. If you have further questions when you're doing your wild scenic stuff, shoot me an email and send Dave to bug me. Dave knows where I am most of the time.
Could you just, for a couple of seconds, put up that, you had a slide at the very beginning with the, about the water, increase in the water height.
Sea level rise, this one?
See, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we're kind of out of time too.
Okay.
So, but thank you, Brian. Very
You're
much
welcome.
for